Well, it's great to see such a turnout, a great audience. Terrific. Welcome to everyone. My name's Leslie Powell. I'm the host for this conversation or this podcast. It's part of a series of book talks that the ICPA and the JCPA have put together to have discussions or interviews with leading authors of textbooks and other research monographs in our field. This is the third in the series. We have a series for 2025 and into 2026. The intent behind the book talks, as you would have seen if you've looked at the other two, is to make them more in a podcast version. I think all of us are a little weary of the traditional format of, the presentation, the slides, the 40-minute lecture, and then, some kind of limited Q&A at the end of it. So I thought we would have something a little, it's not informal. I mean, I'm hoping that the questions are going to be sufficiently interesting and challenging to the authors and editors, but it's meant to be more of an exchange and a discussion, an exploration, rather than just a full bore presentation. So, as I said, this is our third talk. I'm very honored to have Chris Weible, who of course is the editor of one of the absolute leading texts in the field theories of the policy process. To start, as we've done before, and the format for this is a conversation exchange between myself and Chris for maybe about 40 minutes or so. We've got a great audience, but if everybody jumped in, we wouldn't get through the hour. But we'll leave sufficient time at the end for at least a number of questions. The whole session is being recorded, so people can come back to it later if they wish, and I'm sure if someone isn't able to ask a burning question of Chris during the actual book talk, then I'm sure he'd be open to an email exchange or something of that nature. So Chris, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time to have this conversation with us. So I thought to kick off, maybe, I mean, not that you need any introduction, but maybe tell us a little bit about your own research background and maybe where you're at these days, apart from the book, and we'll get into the book immediately, but in terms of your own work.
Absolutely. Thanks, Les. And thanks also to the community involved with JCPA, the ICPA Society. And thanks everyone for showing up. I also know it's December. I know many of us have, I don't know, our finals and grading and everything else, and it's just a busy time of the year. So the fact that so many of you kind of showed up on a December Wednesday like you have, it's just appreciated. Thank you. And so yeah, a bit of a background. Chris Weible, so it is Weible.
Why,
A little correction there. And gosh, I've been studying public policy and I guess policy processes now for about 25 years. So and that includes my time as a graduate student. I'm not just kind of, I don't want to dwell on my background, but I'm not a traditionally trained political scientist or public policy scholar even. My PhD's in ecology, and I've come to this field from a very distinct perspective. Although I've been trained by political scientists, and I always kind of done my research in kind of public policy, political science areas. But yeah, in terms of what I've been doing, I think ever since I took my first class in policy processes, and that was with Peter May at the University of Washington. I think I've always kind of been fascinated with the field and kind of been studying ever since. I think my career goal has always been kind of studying and kind of advance this area of scholarship at a global scale. And the last couple of years, I should say, of course, I continue to edit the theories of the policy process, and it has a companion book with methods of the policy process, which I co-edit with Sam Workman. But yeah, I mean, right now I'm the interim dean at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver, which basically means I've essentially no time for research at this point. Hopefully this won't last forever. It's not my intent to be the permanent dean, but I will say for everyone, like as a researcher, I especially the young researcher, I didn't quite appreciate the amount of time and leadership and investment that some of the senior people in my field dedicated themselves to providing this kind of support structure. And now that I'm kind of a little bit older, I've really learned to say, hey, our field does not exist if we don't have editors of journals, deans of schools, directors of this, everything that we provide to kind of help support our collective action. So that's kind of my turn to kind of at least be this interim dean for a year or two. So that's what I'm doing now, but I still try to provide as much research as I can on, you know, I've done a lot of my research involves the advocacy coalition framework, but I've dabbled with across the theories and beyond the theories. But right now it's like predominantly almost all my research involves coalitions and that sort of world. But I don't know if that's the type of introduction you're looking for, less, but that
Perfect.
can,
Yeah,
you know,
perfect. Especially those inspiring words about having gone over to the dark side of administration, even if only for a limited period of time. It is a pretty important contribution that we can make to the field. So let's get right into it. A bit of a softball question, but I think it has important implications both for the teaching, administration, and the research side of things. I mean, right in the introduction, you kick off with a distinction between policy analysis and policy research, and you use a kind of chess, the game of chess, as an analogy for distinguishing between the two. Could you kind of elaborate on that and unpack it a bit?
happy to. Yeah, of course. And what this is referring to is the introductory chapter of the theories of the policy process. And in that, I devote a little bit of time to try to understand, um, you know, the, the categories or the areas of kind of scholarship that kind of define sometimes where we kind of play as researchers, teachers, and students, and so forth. Uh, and I do make a distinction between, I divide the study of public policy into policy processes and policy analysis. I'm not the first person to do that. I mean, as far as I understand, it dates back to Laswell, who first kind of laid these distinctions, this kind of foundation back in the early 1950s. Um, and I do use a chess analogy in the book, which I think um, is a useful way of kind of categorizing. And I also say that it's not the first time I've used that analogy. It was first used in an article back in 2020 with Anna Dernova. But in general, if you think of, if you divide public policy into these two areas, one being policy analysis is traditionally defined as, or not traditionally, this I would define it as, um, it's not always client oriented, but basically providing advice on the future impacts of policy, or sometimes evaluating our policy choices. And in the game of chess, for example, it might be if a policy analysis might look at a single move or the potential for a single move, and they might provide advice to the chess player about, should they move this piece there or somewhere else, or even pick up a different piece. Or I might look back and say, well, this piece has been moved. Was that a good choice? What are the perhaps benefits and costs, the trade-offs of that choice? And a policy process scholar would approach it very differently. They might look at thousands of games of chess and develop theories about how the game's played. And they might look at theories of the opening moves of the chess board, the theories of the middle of the game, theories of how to close a game, to checkmate or stalemate. And so it's a different orientation. Laswell was very clear that, like in his policy sciences, that a good policy scientist would do both policy analysis and policy process. It's almost like you need to understand the context of theory in order to move those pieces well on the board. We've, most scholars, I would say, actually, I can't say this. I do think some scholars kind of fall in one or the, either policy process or policy analysis, but I will say it's very blurry. And, I'm consider myself more of a policy process scholar, but I often and usually use the theories that I use to, the provided advice is perhaps a little bit too strong, but I do support communities and do engage scholarship all the time. Um, and I know policy analysis folks also, might incorporate context like you might find in the policy process to help do those forecasts or whatever they're doing. And so they do blur, but I do think distinction is important in courses. Like when I was a PhD student, I took a course in policy analysis and I took a course in policy process. So I do think that distinction is very common across a lot of our MPP curriculums and other curriculums. Um, so yeah, but also really recognize that these terms are used differently across the world, including even the term public policy, which doesn't translate into languages sometimes,
Hmm. Hmm.
or even policy sciences. I you know I mean we can dive into like how these words are used differently across the world. So it is I do find it kind of fascinating on an academic level on that sort
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
um,
We'll come back to this because I've got another question near the end about the kind of issue about impact, again, which you raise in your concluding chapter, the impact of research. But in terms of, and I get this is a bit unfair because there's so much scope, of course, in the various chapters in the book, and you're the editor, you didn't write each and every chapter, but there are some pretty substantial differences and divergences among the different approaches, obviously. Again, in the introductory chapter, you kind of make the case that these are multiple lenses and these can all kind of coexist, and maybe the researcher or analyst will choose one or another lens depending on the purpose at hand, the objective at hand. And but I mean, the differences among the approaches can often be quite radical. Can you comment a little bit about what you think are at the highest high level, the ontological, epistemological differences among the different among the approaches, and make them, if not incompatible, then a little bit more than just a matter of shifting lenses from one to the other?
Mhm. Good question. I mean, first off, when we think of divergence, I like just um, kind of just turn that around just a little bit, and just when we think of the differences, one way to think about how they're different is in the scope by which they're typically applied. When I say scope, let's say the typical questions or objectives that either might be asked or tried to achieve by using them. And oftentimes it's the theories. Also say there's almost like a core area or perhaps a textbook area that they're typically either very good at kind of doing research in those areas, or sometimes it's kind of like the first area that they started at, or it's almost like the popular area that people think of as, okay, this is really useful. Because I do think the theories, um, their scopes are expanding, which is also a good thing. And so sometimes when I say, well, this theory is good for this question, um, sometimes it's like, well, I could also answer this question, but this is the question that's like the heart of what the theory is about. And just as an example, I will say, like, you pick up multiple streams and say, well, this particular approach has been around for 40 years and traditionally is really, really strong. And I saw Raimut, by the way, who's a contributor on the chapter. I don't know if he's still here. It's traditionally really good at agenda setting and policy, later policy change. But and so if you want good a good approach for answering those questions, multiple streams is amazing for that. And but also it's kind of moved into implementation, which a lot of people may not think of it as that, but it's also good for that. But it's kind of like that's kind of like the core of what it's doing as an example. But let's say if you want a perspective on, well, what's the long-term impact on say citizen engagement from a policy decision. Well, multiple streams, I guess, could be used for that, but it'd be a little harder. But policy feedback theory, really, that's kind of like part of its core area. Um, and let's say if we wanted to look at, well, you know, instead of looking at, let's say, agenda setting or impacts on the citizens, we want to understand, let's say, conflict and um, how people engage in collective action and trying to influence public policy. Well, we can use the advocacy coalition framework for that, or even like the narrative policy framework, depending if we want to look at, let's say, the discourse of the narratives or the behavior of coalitions. And so there are different, I mean, I don't necessarily think these are in conflict at all, these different lenses, these different questions, but I do believe the policy processes is so complex that one theory cannot explain it all, and we need multiple theories. And I will say, when I say complex, it's just also we have to think of it across different political systems over time and everything else. It's just you need multiple perspectives. And on that too, I would say you talked about the ontological and epistemological differences. Kind of shifting to kind of the ontology side, there are different, let's say, baseline assumptions of what the theories think kind of perhaps exists in the world, so to speak, and what we should pay attention to. And I do think there's differences there. Multiple streams does talk about, let's say, these independent kind of merging streams, which is very different than other theories. But at the same time, I think all of these theories share almost like for the most part, you know, uh, a certain perspective where the agencies typically with individuals, people, um, with set within a context. Um, and so it's definitely not like it does not assume atomized people kind of making choices like again outside of let's say whatever context or whatever situation they're in. Um, all of them kind of share some kind of baseline assumptions, which I think makes them somewhat compatible. But yeah,
Mm.
but sometimes the assumptions are just very different across them
Mm.
about what they think matters in the world, and that's what also makes them kind of attractive to some people, and perhaps one theory might not be attractive to another for these reasons, and but also gives them power for being divergent and providing different perspectives on the policy process.
Mm. Let me follow up with something that you mentioned in the conclusion, but just in passing, you talk about theoretical modules,
Mm.
and maybe this was a way of kind of introducing a variety of different approaches. But I'll quote you to yourself. You write that I think you're defining these theoretical modules as, and quote, units that offer a narrow and distinctive theory, ideally with a method capable of being uploaded into one of these theories for a particular purpose or applied towards its own development without the theories in this volume. So I was kind of wrestling with that, and it's only in one paragraph. You kind of just drop it
Mhm.
in there, and then it's gone. So it looks like this is connected to your previous points. Can you kind of expand a little bit about what a theoretical module and
Oh, yeah. I don't know if that's the right term, but I do believe there's the spirit behind it. I'll try to communicate. But um, as an example, I think what makes, first of all, what makes the theories valuable is that they are constantly evolving and changing. And so a student can come in and they can pick up, and oftentimes we're pretty self-critical of our theories. So, like, my students, they can come in and they say they want to work with ACF. I can, we'll critique it, tear it apart, and there's a place for students to kind of play, for example. And I'd also think that, there's value for kind of advancing theory, but also sometimes if I were to critique our field, sometimes I feel like if you want to make a contribution, you have to create a new theory, a new framework or something.
Hmm.
And then it's like, well, do we need like a gazillion different theories? And I was like, well, there's always space for new ones, but I don't know if that's the only way to make a contribution. And also think sometimes there's ideas that, and I don't know the right term, or cross-cutting is the only thing I can say, and that are used across multiple theories. And she's not on here. Avi Petridou is kind of some of the leader on this. I know, but Tom could kind of pipe in here, Tom Birkeland. But like concepts like the policy entrepreneur,
Hmm. Okay.
it can be uploaded into, it's using the ACF, using
Hmm.
multiple streams, it's using punctual equilibrium theory. It can go almost
Hmm.
anywhere.
Hmm.
Um, and it's one of those concepts that it kind of, I think there's a whole literature around it, but almost one of those
Right.
things where it could be developed into almost like an app, like on your phone, and uploaded
Right.
to multiple theories. And I think there's super a lot of value in this. Um, and I'll say multiple streams, same thing. Focus at events. Tom's devoted a lot of time to this. I almost think you can take that concept
Right.
and upload it into, let's say, another theory, and
Right.
I think it have value. Um,
Hmm.
and I do say like a scholar like Philip created a new method, well, not method, a tool for helping us analyze discourse with the discourse network analyzer. I mean, his impacts have been non-trivial across the field, but it's not a new theory. And so with the
Hmm.
modules, that's kind of where I'm getting at. I think learning is
Yeah.
a good example. Learning can see it across all the theories, and there's all these great ideas on learning. Do we need a brand new framework with infrastructure? Well, maybe. I'd be welcome, actually. But I'd love to if we can figure out how to like take learning as almost like an app that could be uploaded.
Hmm.
Um,
That's
that's
a
where the
really
module came from. I don't know if I have the right terms because no one actually uses that term, but I've never heard that from anybody but you, Les. So,
Well, I know I'm just drawing it from your chapter. You're the one who used that term theoretical module, but I like the notion of a module or an app as a more delimited kind of cluster, maybe, or a single concept, as you said here, associated perhaps with a distinctive method, and either, as you say, uploading or plugging it in, a plug-in module. I love that kind of analogy because it's something that you can take within a larger theoretical framework or context, and it's an elaboration or an extension. Yeah, because that's what apps or modules typically are. They're extensions. And that's also a computer analogy. They're extensions of the larger framework. And I think from a teaching point of view, it would be really interesting because then you don't raise the bar so high to tell your grad students, well, you got to come up with a chapter 8 for the theories of the policy process, which will be a completely new theoretical framework. You can say, take any one of these and dig a little bit deeper and find something that might be a module that would be an elaboration or an extension of that. I think that's really interesting. It's the first time I've really thought about it that way. But I think for even just for a teaching point of view, it would be an interesting way of getting your students to kind of push the boundaries of these whatever theoretical framework they wanted to tackle.
Yeah. And then
Um,
go ahead.
I'm going to keep your feet to the fire here because you did mention in passing comparative contexts, and I think it's fair to say that I mean, most of these, all I think probably of the, though they over time, particularly the longer lived theoretical frameworks that have been around for 30 or 40 years, have had an extension beyond the Western liberal democratic kind of institutional framework. But I think it's still fair to say that most of these are tilted or still grounded in a kind of Western liberal democratic set of assumptions about the way the policy process operates. How applicable, are they? Are some more or less applicable, or have some had the experience? I think ACF in particular has been explored in more comparative contexts. But what do we do about these theories of the policy process when we're confronted with authoritarian systems, the number of which seem to be increasing, or something like the Beijing model? Or policy processes. I mean, I have some experience with this operating in an Islamic context. I mean, that's 1/4 of the world's population are living, in systems that make some kind of connection to Islam. So how do we grapple with that in terms of the theories and frameworks that are developed in the book?
Yeah. Okay, really good question, Les. And I do think, um, first off, every theory has been applied outside the United States in a variety of different contexts. And so whether or not it should happen, it is happening. So there is, like, I would say, perhaps, I don't know if a market or at least some people out there view these theories as useful outside of, let's say, Western democratic situations. Um, and uh, and so that's one point. And so do they show, like, a um, let's say, a Western bias, and how much does that kind of influence, let's say, how we apply it? I say, should they be applied? Like, for example, let's say we're taking I'll say the advocacy collision framework. I can pick on that, but I think I could pick on any theory. If you were to apply that in China or other parts of the world, um, the you know the political institutional kind of the opportunity structures that constrain and give those opportunities to coalitions differ, and coalitions will be different in China than they would be in the United States. Uh, and uh, and so in some respects, as long as we kind of think of, you know, what um, you know, uh, really ask questions about, because we know we'll find coalitions in China. We've seen this,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but the opportunity structures will show different structures to those coalitions, different members, different behaviors, different relationships with opponents and allies. Different depends on where the coalition is in the Chinese system. Different relationships with, say, with the central government, um, and uh, and perhaps those questions we're not asking enough, perhaps. And then
Mhm.
and what I usually say, and people have heard me say this, I think, in many situations, a lot of these frameworks make a distinction between a framework and a theory. A framework provides the general infrastructure, and a theory provides more of the conceptual intervariable logic of the structure of the hypotheses. The frameworks, I really believe, are generalizable across many contexts. The theories
Mhm.
within the frameworks aren't always that way. And so, like, I do think if you apply the ACF to Iran, which it happens, uh, you might want to think, okay, so what, given the framework says, okay, look at these sort of things, what theoretical arguments um, should be or how should the theory should be adapted to that particular context to understand the coalitions in Iran compared to the United States. And I think people apply these theories across different contexts, but they're not updating the theories as much as they should be, or even creating, let's say, well, we need to look, here's the authoritarian, almost like an app, almost like here's the authoritarian assumptions that we need for these sort of political systems, and this is how coalitions might look like in these systems. And that's not, I don't think, done enough. I would say some theories, because ACF has such a strong political lens, some theories are actually more applicable, I think, than others. So I do think policy diffusion and innovation, because
Yeah.
looking at the inputs into a black box of decision making and the outputs, makes it really adaptable across political systems because you don't need to know what's in the black box.
Hmm.
As long
Hmm.
as you get outputs of that black box and inputs. ACF tries to get inside that black box, but I do think that black box is going to be different across countries,
Hmm. Hmm.
or even within countries. So, is it happening? Yeah, absolutely. Are they applicable? Absolutely. Do we need to adapt the theories? Absolutely. Should we update the frameworks eventually? Sure. Are some more applicable than others? Yes.
Hmm.
Uh, but I do think I think one of the major advances we've seen in the last 10 years is just this proliferation of the applications of the theories across different parts of the world and the lessons we're learning that we just took for granted.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's just invaluable and provides that comparative lens. And so I'm excited about it. I do worry about some sort of, I don't know, intellectual position, almost like a colonial type argument.
Yeah.
Worry about
Yeah.
the theories crowding out ideas.
Yeah.
But also I'm excited about the network that's created to support public policy that's partly here. And so
Hmm.
it's a bit
Hmm.
of a trade-off. And also, but I'd say the same thing about this hegemonicness of the policy theories, even in the United States. You never want these theories to crowd out new ideas. And that I think good journal editors will allow those ideas to float in the market and see where they go. But I do think it's hard for new ideas to establish themselves because we have a very crowded theoretical landscape compared to, let's say, 40 years ago.
Yeah. Um, One of the, just to pick up on that, if I may comment on from my own side for a moment. I mean, when I was in Qatar for the last few years, I was trying to trying to apply these tools, intellectual tools developed in a Western context to try to understand that system. And what I found it useful to do was to maybe think in somewhat more functional terms. Like, for example, all policy systems need some kind of advisory capacity because policy leaders, whether they're authoritarian or democratically elected, have to try to make sense of, even if it's for the most narrow, and that was not the case in Qatar, but even if we could conceive of a political system that was completely individualistic and authoritarian and run by a single dictator despot, he or she might still require advice from their astrologer or their
Mhm.
spouse or their henchman, but they need advice. You don't find a complete autarky, personal autarky that way. So thinking in terms of advisory systems helped me understand that there might be different configurations of those systems. The other kind of functionalist example is feedback.
Mhm.
Uh, Again, unless you're dealing with a complete auto diktat, even quasi-authoritarian, non-democratic systems in the traditional sense need some kind of idea of what's happening with the populace, even if only to control them. So what kind of feedback do they draw absent elections? Are there other ways? It could be surveillance, or it could be, mechanisms that don't show up on the Western radar. I mean, in the case, to come back to this example of Islamic societies, there's often very communitarian-based modulus type forms of consultation that don't show up on the radar if you're thinking in terms of a Western lens, but are actually pretty relevant to the organic processes in that kind of political system and that with those kinds of traditions. So I agree with you. I mean, there's lots of exciting ways in which we can take some of the tools that have been developed in the quasi-Western context without being colonial about it, but just try to see how they work functionally in other types of systems. That leads me to another question: global policy processes. I mean, you've got a whole chapter on diffusion with Osmani and colleagues. But how well do you think our theories of the policy I mean, they've been, typically, I think traditionally, if we go back to, 30, 40 years ago, the policy process was the domestic policy process, like what happened with Congress, president, legislatures. And the world's changed for obvious reasons. And you've got a separate chapter on the kind of global dimension. But, if you think about like the UK budget, the Treasury Ministry and minister in delivering that budget had her eyes back on global financial markets.
Mhm.
We think about issues like health and pandemics, and you did work on COVID-19 and the impact there. Immigration, I mean, which is affecting everything from the U.S. to Europe. So we have these global factors, global forces, global institutions, global actors that are increasingly entangled with the domestic. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's a great question, and I'm going to back up a little bit because I think, and this might be a bit of an overgeneralization, but I do think a lot of the as public policy scholars, but even like policy theories, we kind of operate oftentimes at this kind of um, I don't say we always operate somehow a subset of our political system. If we focus on a policy topic, and it could be uh, immigration, it could be water, it could be education, um, and because we're always a subset, the questions you're asking are always there. And that question is okay. So if we're looking at, let's say, education in the United States or any country, education policy, there's always questions about, well, how does this fit within the broader political system? And how does that broader political system kind of both constrain and provide opportunities for education policy and vice versa? How does this particular policy area impact the broader system? And there's always this interaction. And I don't think we always do a good job of understanding how the policy areas we're studying fit within the broader political system. And I bring that in terms of globalization because it's kind of similar in a way in the fact that like you kind of mentioned this kind of there's always this kind of give and take. Well, if we're studying, I've actually edited a book on applying the ACF. This is with Alex Osai-Kojo. We have applying the ACF in across 8 African countries. It's coming out with Oxford University Press. It's coming out. I think the book will be published in January of 26, so about a month from now. But it's really fascinating to look at 8 countries and the coalitions in across these African countries, and also how especially in a lot of these countries, these international NGOs to kind of these big big companies. I can't words escape me right now, are influencing kind of internal affairs. And perhaps in this situation, perhaps a lot of these, at least how we studied it, we did not look at how some of these kind of policy issues in Ghana or wherever might affect the global scene. But I bet that also happens where we have, certain organizations in the United States affecting basically global policy in other countries in terms of the norms and um, norms are kind of the most thing. Norms and various policies are accepted from issues of morality to perhaps issues of climate change. Um, how those that affects everything else. So there's always this tension, not tension. There's always these questions of the interdependence of what we're studying and how it applies to the broader system. And I don't think we've really. I can't think of a single theory that does a good job of talking about all the different ties that, let's say, ties, ways that they interact. It could be resources, it could be norming, it could be a certain policy decisions, and I think that's something that as we think of the increasingly interconnected world, we probably don't study enough, actually. I mean, crises kind of like COVID-19 forces us to think about how subsystems and policy issues kind of interrelate
Mm,
and how expertise spans the world. Uh, we do know, like, Osmani is a great example of looking at these transnational networks and the diffusion of different policies across, let's say, the global South. Uh, but this interdependence, as you'll see everywhere within the United States, of course, we see it across states. Uh,
mhm,
and so European Union and European states, similar dynamics. So we do see it everywhere. Do we do it well? I don't know. I think we can do it better. Um,
mhm.
and uh, and I do think there's a limitation that the policy process theories, too many of them um, do play, I guess, this summary kind of almost the case study level, and struggle with bringing in the context and this broader interactions.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, just to expand that a little bit in terms of the ACF, I mean, I confess I'm not familiar with sort of the latest developments because, like you, I was I was immersed in administrative issues for the last few years, so I haven't kept up as well. But in the ACF, I mean, I could imagine coalitions, advocacy coalitions, being understood as coalitions that bridge both the domestic and the global. Keck and Sikink, I mean, years ago, we're talking about international advocacy. So has that field expanded to try to capture the linkages that might exist?
Not enough, actually. No, I would say. I
Uh,
mean, I don't, it's hard to find. I think you'll find that, let's say, in the European Union, like, because there's so, I think it's a little bit different setting.
yeah.
I do think you find it in some countries, let's say, the global south, you might find, because they're often the target of developmental type programs, and you'll see these kind of collisions at the global scale interacting with collisions at the more the domestic. Um, I see it less in like what I study, but you do see like, people are aware of what's happening, let's say in parts of Europe on certain policy issues. And so
Hmm.
there's definitely some sort of diffusion there, of ideas and strategy and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But it is something that's not studied enough. And I do think coalitions are getting smarter in terms of um, like almost like a vertical integration from the global to the domestic down to the individual person. And some coalitions are really getting smart on this, but I've not documented that well enough, but I do think
Hmm.
that's happening. And across
Hmm.
policy topics, I think we're at the situation now where, this kind of idea of a coalition just studying and dealing with one issue, and when issues are interconnected, or when our problems span topical area like climate change is a good example, or COVID, or
Yeah.
whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And I think this interrelationships between policy issues uh, is I think that's an area that we could probably devote a lot more attention to, honestly.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
I think of something like the SDGs,
mhm.
being this kind of uber global framework that, I mean, obviously was contributed to by domestic actors, but then once it becomes a global policy framework, everybody kind of situates and orients themselves, even if it purely for purposes of advantage and positioning. But it became this kind of part of our policy language, right? I think even in the US, I'm not so sure, but because there's been maybe a bit more resistance in the U.S. policy discourse
Yep.
to gesturing toward the international. But I mean, that's, the SDGs are coming to a close more or less pretty soon, 2030, but something else will replace them. And the Paris Agreement is another good example of a kind of Uber framework. So I'd love to see more work on that kind of connection between, as you say, these both advocacy coalitions, but the narrative frameworks and discourse frameworks that structure domestic policy discussions in many cases.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
even at the very simple level. I do a lot of work in Colorado. I mean, we're kind of talking to sort of the rural branch of a coalition yesterday, and
Yeah.
talk about how much they're kind of interact with the kind of the urban branch. They're all interconnected for the same state on the same policy issue.
Right.
But still, like in over the houses, kind of what's going on in Colorado is part of the national discourse of the national coalition. I mean, these are discussions that they could just take resources to tackle, right?
Uh-huh.
And I think it
Uh-huh.
makes it really hard, actually. And that's just within the states. I mean, the global scale. I mean, I don't know. I know you do work there less. I mean, I don't know how to tackle that with
Hmm.
the type of work I do without uh, um, a sizable grant.
Yeah. Okay, but so we need grants, but maybe this notion of theoretical modules, to plug in to try
Yeah,
to
there you
capture
go.
some of this as well. Just a couple more questions before we kind of open it up, but let's shift gears a bit on two big kind of questions. One is, how we think about change and how well the theories capture policy change, policy rupture, I guess might be another way to think about it. And a related big question is how we grapple with the impact of single or singular individuals in the policy process. I mean, these frameworks almost are intended to squeeze out, I mean, to greater or lesser extent, the role of the great man or the great woman. How do our theories capture a force as disruptive as a Trump or a
Yeah.
Thatcher? or an
Right.
Indira Gandhi, or on and on and on. So in the real world, we seem to be preoccupied with the impact of these singular individuals on an historical stage, but our theories are all about process, institutions, kind of the constraints, and they're generalizable. They're generalized. They're not individualized. So two big questions for you:
Yep.
change and individual impact.
Yeah. No, at the one level, just given the change in the United States, the change in our, let's say, the general um, purpose of government, let's say the shift in the almost like a macro ideology. And I do think it's kind of moving away from some sort of neoliberalism assumptions to something different. Um, um, the cool, if you're looking at, I think it depends on the type of uh, theory you're applying. Like if you're doing like a diffusion across the U.S. states, you might not because you kind of ignore what's in the black box to see the output. It's going to take us a long time to figure out, hey, gosh, these macro changes with Trump and everything else, it's changing the patterns of diffusion across the US states. I mean, like we won't be able to get that until like 2035, right? I mean, that's so, but that's still valuable to get. And maybe we could get it. We'll see changes at 25. I don't know. Maybe.
Mhm. Mhm.
If you're sitting coalitions now, it's almost unavoidable that depending on the topical area, I'm sure there's some that are kind of immune, that it's that you see the impacts immediately, right? And that's we're seeing that in coalitions that I'm studying and everything else. Backing up a little bit, what we're not doing well is I do think, and again, I'm not using the right words, but a lot of our theories are kind of these kind of meso isn't the right term, but they focus on a subset of our political system. Again, we focus on policy areas as policy scholars, and the result of that, we kind of ignore or overlook too much the broader political system and the patterns that are happening. And so, is there a theory that can talk about the fall of, let's say, neoliberalism and the rise of Trump and everything else? I mean, maybe punctual equilibrium can get at parts of that,
Yeah.
but but
Yeah.
but that's happening almost in the background, and we're studying what's in the foreground too much, and kind of missing those kind of broader explanations. And policy feedback, I think, has Paul Pearson's work has really perhaps dived into that in terms of
Yeah.
the shifting patterns we're seeing in the states. So it's not devoid, but I think that if there's a threat to what we're doing right now in policy process theory, is our tendency to focus on the particular policy area without understanding the changing context enough.
Mm. Mm.
And
Mhm.
how do we bring that context into our studies, regardless of the theory? And I think that's true across the world right now, given the shifting circumstances we're in, and and it also forces us to think more broadly. Well, how does this kind of the broader context affect what we're studying, and might it affect some aspects of the theory we're looking at, or the tendency, for multiple streams, how these streams are, how they couple, or, I see Sir probably there. I always remember and appreciate your work on venue shopping. Does it
Mhm.
affect what
Mhm.
venues are available? And that sort of thing, how interest groups kind of shop across those variables, which is another one of those cross-cutting concepts. I think almost everything thinks about everything.
Mhm.
Many theories kind of bring in these kind of venue shopping type ideas. Um, so no, I think we do capture the result of it. We can do better at capturing the forces driving it, although I do think policy feedback theory can do a pretty good job at that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Um, I don't know what I'm more a comment. I'm just wondering, are we in an epoch or a period of, well, there's always periods of change, but it feels at a gut level like the tectonic plates on which the policy process rests have been shifting. And if we focus too much on the micro stuff, we miss the fact that the whole landscape has kind of tilted in pretty dramatic ways.
yep,
And we can get caught up with the micro analysis and miss the fact that the micro is being dramatically affected by that macro. But that would require almost a bifocal vision, to go back to the notion of lenses. You'd have to wear bifocals or trifocals to try to capture everything simultaneously. And that's one of the challenges, I guess, of just trying to do informed analytical work to keep the macro in the foreground somehow or background and still do the micro stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I do think the theories are doing that. I mean, but I think I agree with you. We're in a shifting time,
Mm.
but I do think I mean, maybe it's just me and the people I interact with. I do think we are coming to terms with what that time is. And then we're coming to terms with what are the implications of these times on our theories and how our theories can help understand them need to be adjusted the by this new time. Um, I think the error would be to kind of keep doing our kind of like either micromess or whatever it is, these kind of case
Yeah.
studies and ignoring the context within which they're set.
Hmm.
And 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 that would be unfortunate.
Hmm. Hmm. Let me finish with one inevitable question, and then we'll open it up for some comments and additional questions. But AI. We're all now talking about the impact of AI, but I was just I've been struggling or trying to think about, and you get you run across little tendrils of indications that, the ways in which AI might be affecting the policy process and how we might have to think about that. I mean, and I'll give you a couple of examples that I've been kind of keeping note of, and then I'll ask you to comment. The impact on policy advice. I mean, we have now this notorious example of the Albanian minister, Diela, who I understand, I just checked this morning, she's pregnant and expecting 83 babies. So these are all going to be AI systems that are going to be supporting MPs within the Albanian system. So this AI is not only for policy advice around corruption, Diela, but she's also, it is a she, that's the avatar, is also supposed to be managing contracts and implementation of certain provisions to try to avoid corruption. So there's both the implementation side, but also the advisory side. And other governments are increasingly using AI. On the consultative process, I mean, a big part of, at least traditionally, the consultative process with, say, citizens groups has been to get feedback and input. And again, I was running across something in the New York Times about how regulatory interventions now by even small under-resourced groups can be maximized because these small under-resourced groups can ask an AI to give them, generate a regulatory intervention that makes sense of the entire regulatory infrastructure, which in the past they would have required high-priced lawyers to give them advice on. But now the AI can basically generate the intervention in the letter, and you get this kind of astroturf possibility of the grassroots being, interventions being generated by multiple AIs, but extremely well informed. And then I already mentioned the impact on implementation. AI systems, for example, making determinations about contracts or immigration applications and things of that sort. So I see the vapors of this on the horizon, and I just wonder, is it going to have some kind of, do we have to begin thinking about the impacts of this on policy processes? So I'll open that door for
Yeah.
you and see how far you want to go in.
I'll go. First of all, I think I can go a long ways on this, because I do think it's obvious, not obvious, but it's the impacts are going to be non-trivial in every aspect of, let's say, decision making and even like how we write our narratives, how groups do, opponent analyses to how we even think about implementation, how we evaluate policies, how we give advice. But I will say, let me just turn this on its head too. The policy process, I don't think, has rarely been suffered from lack of information. Uh, in fact, oftentimes we have too much information. We don't know how to handle it.
Mhm.
Uh, I think our big fundamental problems of the policy process lie in our interpersonal relationships, lie with the differences we have, lie with how we handle our conflicts, actually even maintain a coalition, work with our allies, uh, the impacts on people and everything else. I mean, all these things relate basically to, I really do think it's interpersonal. And I don't know if AI is going to help too much with that. And and uh, and it'll provide faster analyses to help us write things more. But I think the fundamental nature, both good and bad, of what it means to be people and humans, that's staying. And in that regard, we're going to basically get, the policy processes being, you know, maybe we'll get the problem stream going crazy and the policy stream going crazy, but it's still going to take that political stream to kind of merge these things or at least play into it, and some sort of entrepreneur out there doing something to, it's still going to rely on people. Um,
Okay.
so,
Okay.
so it'll be interesting to see what happens, as both the interim dean and the School of Public Policy and Public Administration. Yeah, I'd love to bring more AI into every single class I'm teaching, and and how we train students and engage. But the fundamental nature of it, I mean, we're still dealing with people and interpersonal issues. That
Mm,
aside, you also mentioned something about extraordinary individuals, to some extent, like, you got policy entrepreneurs, we have brokers. There's a lot of agents in the policy process that um, have been played with and developed, and it's actually merging into their own little like modules, maybe. Um, I do think we could probably, do we need more little agent categories? Well, maybe, I don't know. But I will say, I think a lot of times that like, this kind
mm,
of heroic kind of individual in the policy process, like an entrepreneur, if I were to critique anything with that, it would be, well, we should probably look at more of the networks of people. Because oftentimes, even if you do have an amazing leader, they're always kind of set within a
yeah.
context and resources and other people around them. And so I do wonder, like, how much is that like a like the Superman type thing? Is that kind of a Western construct? And how much is it kind of, should we think of more of a communal nature of things? But um, no, I'd love to see more there. But again, I do think the entrepreneur literature as an example is just booming in ways the last 5 years that I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
And so we'll see where that goes.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, policy entrepreneurship captures a little bit of that individual agency component of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, we got about 10 minutes or so. There were some questions that were posted. I don't know if you can see those, Chris.
Yep.
One by Michelle. We had one from Tom, I think, as well. Tom was picking up on the notion of modules. Michelle was asking about common assumptions, the theories share assumptions about pluralism or liberal democracy. So those are two questions that were posted. I don't know if you want to comment again quickly on those two, and then we can entertain if people want to raise their hands or post something in the chat. That might be the best way to do it, to post something in the chat. Rather, otherwise, we'll get a cacophony of interventions, and I won't be
Yeah.
able to manage it particularly well.
I won't spend too much time on Tom's point, although I think I kind of raised it already. I mean, his
Yeah.
career on focus events is a great example of this. Going to Michelle's point, just understand, yeah, I mean, but I will say, like, there's not like liberal democracy versus non-liberal democracy. We know there's like a spectrum, and
Mm,
I think we've seen
yeah.
that. Like, you can basically, I think you can apply these theories in any political system, but the context changes, and we just need to understand the theoretical implications of that changing context. And so, were they kind of born in like a liberal democracy and a degree of pluralism? Yeah, a lot of them were. Do they apply outside of that? Well, yeah, they do. But we just can't do that blindly. We need to like be really careful about how we adapt them. And
Hmm.
I do think a poorly applied theory can overlook and miss the nuances of that might fall outside of a liberal democracy in a pluralist setting of, let's say, Western Europe and US. Um, and Yeah, I think those are the two questions. But thanks, Michelle. I'm
Okay.
sad that she's gone.
Yeah. Um, Well, any other questions? I mean, we haven't, I see Guillaume Fontaine here. We haven't really talked about methods very much.
Mhm.
I don't know if there's any, I mean, you do, as you said, you have this companion volume as well, to the theories. If I may kind of ask another question, I said I would step back, but maybe just to trigger some additional discussion. Any comments or thoughts about methods or developments
Oh,
in
absolutely. I mean,
methodological courses?
I do think like 30 years ago, someone like Paul Sabatier did say, we need better theories of the policy process. And he was reflecting on when all these theories came about and they were being developed, and also frustration with the current kind of theoretical landscape at the time. And even in my book, there's been since then there's like 5 editions of the theories of the policy process. Even like the ACF, I was not that I do this when I'm bored and need something to do, but I just looked up, well, how many applications of the ACF have there been in 2025 so far? I did this last week, and I counted 102 applications. So basically, there's a publication every 3 days of the ACF around the world. And this is
Wow.
one theory. Multiple streams is applied way more than the ACF. I mean, Raymond, I encourage you to do the same thing. Um,
Uh,
and so, uh, but I will also say what Paul didn't say back in 30 years ago about the need for better theories and applying them as, and of course he did say it, but not as bluntly as I'm saying, is that we need better methods. And it's almost like, we have our methods classes, we teach regression and network analysis, but I work with a lot of network scholars now, and once you apply a method with a theory, there's certain assumptions and techniques that are kind of lost in a typical methods class. So I'm really
Mm,
excited with the first edition of the book with Sam Workman on methods of the policy process. I do think if this field is going to go anywhere in the next few years, it's going to be you're going to see really good development of the like how do we operationalize our concepts? How do we measure them? Um,
mm,
and how do we analyze that data once we get it? And I have a paper coming out, I think Allegra Fullerton's on here too, and others with in Policy Studies Journal, I should say, under review. Just about like the underlying assumptions and how we model coalitions. We've been doing
mm,
this for 40 years, and so much of what we do is tacitly understood and behind the veil, and we need to bring that more to the forefront. And so I'm really optimistic and excited about the whole methods emphasis, and I like to see more of it happening. And it's not just, of course, not just quantitative, and we should be posting and sharing our interview protocols and how we analyze the interview transcripts and so forth. That's not done enough. And so anyway, I think we'll get
yeah.
major change there.
And that connects to the AI question I asked. I mean, in terms of, for example, doing the kind of textual analysis that you might have seen people, using qualitative software for. I mean, the AI stuff can go through reams and reams and reams of, say, parliamentary debates or speeches or policy documents and begin to do the kind of more finely grained analysis that would have been very difficult to do with the previous kinds of software we had available.
Absolutely. That's huge. Although also I do plug with some of my um, interpretive and critical theory type colleagues and friends. We can do all this stuff, but sometimes if we analyze all these words, the fundamental question is, what's the meaning behind these words, and what are the power dynamics? And these are questions that policy theories don't ask enough of, and I don't think AI does either. Maybe it does well, but um, I am, and along with that is even theory. I can analyze by manually coding 500 documents, let's say. And if I can't find the theoretical insights and the practical insights out of those 500, maybe I can find it with 500,000. I don't know. But I kind of worry about um, the assumption that more data is going to answer our questions. I do think we need, with that, our theories need to develop um, with those advances. Oh,
Mute.
Lester.
Sorry, there. I'm unmuted. Yeah, sorry. I sort of got offline there for a second or so, so I missed if that was just a comment or a response to a question.
Missed the best part of it, but that's okay. You can look at the recording.
Okay. Okay. Well, are there any closing comments or thoughts that you might have, Chris? I mean, we're close to the end now.
Um, you know, well, first off, I will say, like, which is perhaps great. One of the best things about what, if I were to look at like where are we at now than we weren't, let's say 30, 40 years ago. And I do think the biggest impact is the research community, people kind of interested and dedicated to this field that kind of span the world are increasingly connected.
mm,
I think, there's a whole philosophy of science, which I'm not that much of an expert in, but about what it means to be successful in science. How do we know our theories are doing well or doing poorly? What does it mean that our methods are where they should be or whatnot? And yeah, we can always do better. But I do think, the number one measure of success is actually a vibrant research community. And because you can have a great theory, but the research community kind of drops away or doesn't care, that theory is going to go away.
mm,
So I do appreciate everyone showing up here, which I think a lot of them are part of the community, some not. But I do think like the Conference on Policy Process Research in Bern,
right.
there's other conferences from ICPP to ECPR to Midwest. I mean, invest in the people. And that's what I would say, because I do think it's the next generation of scholars that push things along, um, and the current relationships we have that really kind of set the agenda for the future. So I do appreciate everyone showing up and contributing to that research community. I do think it's the most important part.
Yeah. And it in terms of teaching as well. I mean, I don't know how many. I mean, we haven't done any work on. I don't think anyway on a number of PhD programs. How many what would be your estimate, your rough estimate of how many PhD programs in public policy, not in political science or economics, but in public policy, there are in the US.
Well, it's complicated. I have no idea. There's like
Yeah,
200 and something public administration, public policy type programs with master's
right,
programs,
with
but not
NASPA.
all of them
Yeah,
have PhDs. And a lot of the
yeah,
best students come out of political science units. And I have
right.
PhDs in ecology, which is kind of weird too.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
I do think there's probably 30 to 50 at least in the US,
Hmm.
come from.
Hmm.
But also not all programs. I mean, we have a very big PhD program with about 30 to 40 students in it. And a good number of them focus on policy processes. I know Tom has a good number of students coming out of North Carolina State University. And I know Syracuse, where Sarah Prawley's at, has a good number too. Uh, and so I would say an extremely, it's huge actually. But also what's kind of funny too is like, I kind of joke and talk in Tom's class now and then here and there, but um, we all teach kind of the same thing. And so I'm always surprised that we don't leverage each other. Think about like my universities have to cut resources. I think we all are, right? And so why we don't have like one gigantic policy process class that, not that we want to like homogenize everything, but
Right, right.
sometimes I kind of surprised we don't leverage each other's resources more because
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this book talk series was kind of an initial attempt to do that because we should be talking to each other. I mean, we all of us, here in this audience, I think have got experience either we're somewhere outside of the U.S. or we do travel and teach. And I mean, it's quite remarkable. I've been to all around the world, and your book is used. There's a excuse me, there's a kind of compendium or a canonical group of books and texts and theories and frameworks that people respond to, whether they're in Beijing or in Bern or in Denver or in Ottawa or in Doha. So it's quite interesting to me how that kind of disciplinary conversation is actually global without necessarily some kind of convergence. I mean, people are using these theories as touchstones and guides, but they're adapting and modifying them and applying them in different comparative contexts. So it's quite remarkable to me that we don't, maximize those resources more. So this book talk is an attempt to do that. And I've often thought that through the ICPA, we should be collaborating more in terms of getting Chris from Denver to give an online lecture to somebody, to a group of PhD students in Beijing or in Doha or whatever. And I'm hoping that the ICPA can begin to encourage that kind of exchange because I think you're absolutely right that encouraging the next generation of scholars in PhD programs and in master's programs as well is essential both for the growth of the discipline, but also for the elaboration of theoretical frameworks, because that's where the fresh new ideas and challenges I think are going to come from. So, on
yeah.
that inspiring closing set of notes, let me thank Chris in particular. Thank you very much for taking the time. And to all of our audience, it's been terrific, really, really interesting. And I hope everybody's taking away the lessons and some of the comments from Chris and adapt them to their own research programs going forward.
Thank you, Les. And thank you everyone for showing up. And feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Real pleasure to have you on. Thanks again, Chris.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate it.